It records automatically, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, it's quite good, that. Anyway, welcome everybody to the Icecast Live. I am Shane Chebsey, and next to me is Mr. Ollie McMonee. How you doing, Ollie?
I'm very good, and may I say a very, very belated Happy New Year to all our viewers and to you, Shane, because obviously this is the first one of the new year, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the first one that you've been on.
Yeah.
I think we did another.
Hold on a minute. What are you saying? Oh, that's it. I'm going. Bye.
You missed the first one, mate. The first one was with Dacre Stoker. We did our Dracula special. And Andy was my co-host because you know what horror fan.
Oh yeah, I bet you that was bloody good.
Yeah, it was, mate. It was a good show, actually. We had a bit of a lark. But this evening we're taking a bit of a different flavour, and I'm really, really excited about our guest tonight because Ann Nocenti is actually one of my favourite comic writers of all time. I'm a massive fan, so I'm gonna try and rein in the fanboy questions,
yeah.
and I'm gonna try and keep my cool as best as I can. But we're going to be talking about, amongst other things, her brand new comic series, The Seeds, which I have read, and I believe you've read as well, Ollie.
Yeah, it's on Burger Books. I love that imprint.
Burger Books, yeah, and it's so good, so good. So. Without any further ado, let's run that VT and we'll start off. And welcome back to the Icecast Live. Oh, we've lost Ollie. Oh, where's he gone?
Oh, who needs Ollie?
And welcome to the Icecast Live, Anne. How are you doing this evening?
I'm good.
It's not evening for you, though, is it? Because are you on the East Coast?
I'm in New York City.
Yeah.
2 o'clock in New York City.
Wow. Somewhere I've yet to visit, you know. All these places I've not been to New York. Somewhere I really want to see.
You know, it used to be a really great city. Now it's a dump.
Really? Are you going to upset loads of people by saying that?
Well, too many rich people moved to New York. Now it's a real dump.
Oh, is that what happened?
Yeah.
Did it get gentrified?
Yeah, and they bring all the stupid stuff.
Oh, that's a shame. Sounds like I've missed my opportunity there. Missed the golden era.
You did, really, you did.
So Ollie's not here now. I'm a bit lost because he was going to ask some questions, so I'll just have to wing it. So welcome to the Icecast. Thanks very much for being part of the show tonight. We are predominantly we're going to be talking about The Seeds that you've written and co-created with David Ayer. It is Ayer, isn't it?
You have to say it like aha. Oh,
really? Oh, I've got it wrong all this time.
Look at this beautiful book. It smells really good.
And this you can't get that on digital, can you?
No, you can't. You can't replicate that. No. This is how comics are supposed to be created. Yeah.
Well, no, but David wanted to have it to have a smell, and it does have a smell. It actually smells a lot like my
Teen Spirit.
My paint box.
Oh.
Smells a lot like my paint box.
I do love that sort of freshly printed graphic novel smell.
Yeah.
There's nothing quite like it, is there?
Well,
I know
there is, because I still think the best smell in the world is that open plastic blister of a new toy. It just smells wonderful. I know it's not great for the environment, because I know that's what we're going to be talking about today, but just bear with me. It's just such a lovely smell.
Well, you know, in the 80s, comics smelled like used cars.
Yeah, yeah. And they smell even more like used cars when you get out of
They
the
smelled like sticky used cars. I loved it.
And of course, now they're just sold by used car salesmen.
Yeah.
I just offended every retailer who's watching. So the seeds, Annie, could you tell our viewers what the concept behind the book is, please?
Well, it's centered on a love story between an alien and a human, you know? So it's kind of like it's just a few minutes into the future, like 1 second into the future. In other words, the world is like near death. So, you know, that's going to happen tomorrow. So it's really just tomorrow's future. And it's a reporter who's trying to find the truth in a universe that's drenched in drenched in basically post-truth universe. And the weird thing about it is that David and I came up with the idea before the rise of fake news, and we actually had to roll that aspect back quite a lot because we were afraid it would be a commentary on today, but it's not a commentary on today because it was written 4 years ago. Yeah,
that's an interesting insight, actually, because when I read it, my initial reaction was, well, this is a commentary. You know, it is so relevant whether you meant it to be or not. You know, there is this huge relevance.
In fact, we were worried because it had been 4 years since we were worried it was going to be dated. And then we were like, nah, it's not dated.
It's prescient, if nothing else. Especially there's so many masks in there that I know that you said back in the day when it was first being published to CBR, how you'd been to China, you'd seen these people wearing masks, not only to protection against the smog, but as sort of fashion statements. And of course, we've come full circle now, haven't we, with the pandemic and everyone in the world wearing masks.
Yeah, it was really weird to see how commonplace masks were in China, and how, like, I'll never forget this like crew of guys. They were like Chinese bike messengers, and each one of them had a scary like skull mask, one after the other, and they were basically having fun. This like streak of evil, you know, breaking through traffic, you know, and then and basically a lot of little kids, their masks were their favorite toys, their favorite cartoons. So it was fun. And I kept expecting to see more of that this year during COVID. And I saw a little bit of it, but not a lot of it. But it was interesting to walk around a very polluted city in China and see all these like faces that were dominated by like Bugs Bunny, you know, and I mean, it was fun. It was kind of fun. And I remember at some point I used to teach film in Haiti, and I was talking to my Haitian girlfriends in Haiti when COVID hit, and they were kind of like, yeah, nobody really believes it's going to come here, or it's going to hit. And I'm like, and nobody really wants to wear masks, so they don't have masks. And I'm like, look, you girls are beautiful. Go out and just put the coolest masks on and make it a fashion statement and make it hip and make it fashionable. And I was sending them all these pictures of like gold streaked, you know, cloth that they could use. And so
it's a great way of approaching it, I think. A few people I know here have done that. You know, I've seen people with Bane masks on and things like that, and skull masks. And, you know, you've got to try and own it somehow, haven't you? Because otherwise you feel a little bit helpless. You feel very helpless in the face of what's happening. If you can't put a little bit of yourself into it and make it, you know, your own in some way. And a mask is one small way of doing that, isn't it?
and especially the idea that we all want to know that we're all friendly, and it takes away smiles. And so for a while, I was just taking a marker and putting a smile on my mask. Going
of
out
course,
the way.
that can be equally scary as well. If you smile.
Everybody really believed I was so happy.
Oh, we've had a little comment there from Kenny Gibson. Hi, Kenny. Love Ann's work. So you've got a fan there. Oh.
Thank you. I have one fan.
Yeah, well fan.
I had none left.
Yeah, the other one's coming at 8:30, Annie.
Kenny, you're my first fan.
Obviously, as I was saying off air before, I'm a huge fan myself. I discovered your work a little bit after you started, because I think you started with Marvel. Was it about 1982?
Well,
Bizarre Adventures or something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was just a kid, really. I mean, I was just a kid who stumbled on a job, and so I was writing comics. I like to sort of make the comparison with punk, when you got up on stage and sang and played a guitar that you didn't know how to play or sing yet. That was kind of like my debut in comics, where that was like, I don't know how to play this thing, I don't know how to sing, but you know.
That's a great way of doing things, isn't it? You learn from doing. I mean, how many great artists like that?
In the 80s, everybody was up on stage doing things that they didn't know what they were doing yet. We were all doing that, you know. So
yeah, you can see that.
You're the dead Kennedys of Marvel, Annie.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I'll take that.
That's a good one. So, I mean, my first encounter with your work was on Daredevil. When you did a lot of stuff with, I think it was mostly with John Romita Jr., but lots of other writers as well. Lots of other artists. Yeah, sort of guest spots.
It was mostly John Romita Jr. And it's this weird thing where, you know, comics are collaborative, you know, so you're always looking to play. Like, you want to play with the artist, and Johnny had this. He wanted to play, you know, so we would riff about what was happening in New York and what we wanted to put from the streets of New York into the comic. And I think people don't realize when they read comics how much of the artist is in there, because you're quite often saying, "Hey, Johnny, what do you feel like drawing?" You know, and they'll tell you something that they want to draw, and I can point to a lot of my comics and say. And somebody will say, "What's with the metaphor of the Statue of Liberty in covered in scaffolding? Is that a metaphor for America?" And I'm like, "No, the artist called me up and said, I always wanted to draw scaffolding, you know." And I'm like, "Okay, you know."
Damn, there goes all my questions about the symbolism in the seeds now, Annie.
Oh yeah, it's all basically it was a game. It was a game that David and I were playing, where we just tossed each other stuff. And it's funny because I've been thinking about the process a lot lately, because when we were doing it, we were just doing it. It's like, you know, it's like getting up on stage and playing music. And now I'm thinking, you know, it really reminds me of that old French game, Exquisite Corpse, where you'd fold a piece of paper and then you'd hand it around, and everyone would draw a piece of the body without seeing it.
Oh yeah,
that's basically maybe the closest you can come to how we made the seeds.
Wow. Well, it looks like it's all been planned. You know, it's got. I mean, the visually, I was really impressed with it. You know, with what David did. How he constructed the pages, how he, you know, his page design, and the characters are also recognizable from panel to panel. I mean, I would love to ask him, but I'm assuming that he's using some sort of reference there to get that continuity.
Well, I think that from what I've learned about his process, he draws in notebooks first until he comes up with the basic. So I do tight full scripts.
Right.
David takes the first issue was a little weird. We tossed that one back and forth a lot in the early stages. And David said, "Okay, I'm going to do 9 panel pages, and I'm going to take your story and I'm going to break it down into chapters.
Right.
So, and I'm going to do a large left-hand main chapter. And you can see, look at this page you've got up now. The center panel, I learned a lot from working with David. Like it's like if you play chess, you know how important the 4 center squares are?
Yeah.
What he chose to put in the center of the 9-panel grid was always sort of like the power thing in the panel. And sometimes I'd be like, you know, I asked for a rooster and he put in a tree. What's up with this? And you realize that he needed the tree to do these branching things to connect everything. So we were always looking for nature and the way, and we wanted, with a lot of subliminals and a lot of foreshadowing, for the reader to feel like nature was really smart and knew what it was up to. So even if humans were killing the planet, nature still had. So you can see here, the center panel is the love scene. And it's like the moment, it's them remembering, it's actually a flashback. It's them remembering that they just made love or whatever they did. And as they're realizing they have to split up, that's the alien and the human.
And that's a great example of the use of masks. But obviously, in this example, the masks are more like those kind of gas masks from World War II, aren't they?
Well, yeah, the plot had the thing we were talking about. The plot was full of like the things I saw in China, personalized masks. I never mentioned gas masks ever. And then David said, I want to use gas masks. And you'd have to ask him why he picked it. I think he always just liked them. But you can see that they became perfect ways for the aliens to hide their faces.
Yeah.
They also have that beautiful trunk, you know, it kind of implies an elephant, but also implies that they're, you know, because they're aliens, they can't breathe the air or something. So, you know, and this panel is interesting too, this top panel, because we had, one of the only things that changed from when I first laid out the whole story to, but I laid out the whole story when Obama was president. And when we started putting out the comic, the first issue he was working on in 2016, when Trump became president, we started talking about this main alien as being really kind of a Trumpy nutbag, gas bag, you know, guy who was always watching TV, and he was getting his rhythms from a stupid TV show. And in the Seeds, it's a kind of a goofy alien cartoon. And so then David just came up with this image. This image is not in the script. He just suddenly. So that's when I bring in the exquisite corpses. I was certainly thinking about America and Trump. David's in Spain thinking about Spanish politics, which were going through all kinds of transitions at the time. But, you know, he sort of like just resonated with this. So the process was very interesting because a lot of it was intuitive.
It's very much, it sort of reminds me in some ways of a sort of like a man who fell to earth type story. You know,
done by the Dead Kennedys.
Yeah.
That looks like a perfect Dead Kennedys cover.
I mean, there's so many connotations there with that whole, you know, the temptation for the alien of the human culture. You know, because when I was reading the book, I noticed how, you know, the aliens were being tempted, if you like, by the trappings of human culture. And, and I love that.
In a weird way, it's like if you go deep sea swimming, you're tempted to swim with dolphins. You know, it's sort of like, I think it was more like they're curious about humanity. And, you know, we went with some of the actual alien tropes. They're cold. They're like, like the reptilian, and they like human warmth. But yeah, I mean, it's also when I first started thinking about the aliens, I thought of them as really bad plumbers. Like, and it comes from, I was telling this story, and I didn't even know if David would understand it, but I was just like, just think of them as these plumbers that come to fix your sink, but they really just, you know, blow a gasket and wreck your plumbing and flood your house, you know? So it was like, I saw them as like, you know, just sort of like bad at their jobs, and their jobs were very much like, you know, the mechanic who it's his first day and he opens the hood and he doesn't really know what type goes to what. So they weren't, I didn't want them to be, you know, how in movies they're always super advanced and intelligent. And I knew I wanted the opposite of that. And there was even the scene that introduces the aliens in the script was them building this junk spaceship in a junkyard, and you couldn't really tell, had they just crash landed and were fixing it, or were they building it? Were they crazy? You know, did this thing even fly? Could it fly? You know, and when David made a decision to put the aliens underground in a kind of more like old New York City subway labyrinth type thing, then we lost the spaceship. But I think he did do a drawing of the spaceship that sort of captured that, you know, are they real? Are they not real?
Hopefully one day maybe those lost drawings will be shared.
Well, there's some of them in, do you know Hussein's Panel by Panel?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. He's been a guest on my shows. Yeah. Yeah.
So his current issue is a deep dive into the seeds, and there's a lot of David's drawings that from his concept drawings. Yeah.
Yeah. I highly recommend that to any of our viewers who are not familiar with it. It's the panel by panel, isn't it? It's
panel by panel. Yeah. And he, you know, he's just, it's really, it's really the only publication that I know of that literally gets into the actual craft of words and pictures and balancing words and pictures. And Hussein is a letterer, so he especially, you know, understands the rhythms of lettering and how it changes the rhythm of the comic.
Yeah, he's a great host. Actually, I really enjoyed watching it live. He did a live show for us at one of our festivals.
Oh, cool. Yeah, he's wonderful. He's really. I mean, I had a film magazine for a whole decade called Scenario, and what we did was we looked at I interviewed screenwriters and directors as to how the shooting script changed, how the original script changed to the shooting script, then changed after the film was shot and edited. So it was sort of the 4 writing drafts of making a film: the script, the shooting of it, and the editing of it. And so we really got into the nuts and bolts of, you know, why is that scene 2 seconds shorter? Why did that scene have to go? Why did that scene move over here? You know, so I'm obsessed with that kind of craft.
But you see that skill from film very much even in the pages we've shown of the seeds. That certainly, when I was reading it, it did feel very filmatic, very cinematic. And I love that pacing of the first chapter, the first issue. Where there's so much mystery built up. You know, the wall keeps on getting mentioned. You've got this inclusion on that first page, and a follow on from the cover of the hexagonal design that you do see in nature so much, getting back to this idea that, you know, even if we haven't got a plan, nature seems to have a plan, and nature will always find a way.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, something I've always because David and I started talking about how we just started seeing hexagrams everywhere once we started realizing, you know, and I'm like, oh my God, look at that pineapple. It has a hexagram on it, you know. And then I don't know if you were watching the news today, but they have taken Melania Trump's dress, I guess maybe had hexagons on it.
Oh, I know the one. Yeah.
And they've blown it up to zoom in to show that it's actually Bernie Sanders sitting in each hexagon. And I was like, oh wow.
That's amazing.
Hey, what, Fanny? We stumbled across it. Well, congratulations to America, but over here in Britain, I've fallen in love with CNN over the last few weeks, because in America you are allowed to be left wing or right wing on television news, where we aren't in Britain. But I found it quite refreshing. I went to bed last night, long before the Foo Fighters were playing, I hasten to add, but I went to bed quite excited on America's behalf.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it must have been I mean, I was living in Britain. How was that for you over there?
I mean, I think that, we were all scared and holding our breaths for 4 years. And it's not like we're breathing again, really, because we're still sort of nervous about and it's weird because the Seeds is about this. I mean, Ashley, the reporter, is always saying, I can create a myth and make it. Her boss is like, I did a story about a vampire cult once, and I had to become the lead vampire to make the story true. And I'm always making these jokes in the comic about people having to create news, and we're kind of like, oh shit, half of this country thinks the election was stolen. They think the election was some kind of Bill Gates implant virus.
Incredible conspiracy theories. I mean,
they're
I've
phenomenal.
heard so many. Yeah,
what do you mean?
Incredible imagination.
They're not true.
It's like a flat Earth someplace where there's a pedophile ring, and they're all eating Hillary Clinton's pizza, and Bill Gates's implants, and therefore the election was stolen. And you're just kind of
It's incredible. It's incredible how people will ignore facts that disprove the theories as well. It's like, oh yeah, that's the thing about conspiracy theorists, isn't it? They can just say, well, that's not true, that's a lie, they're just making that up. Everything that disproves it, it's. But
you know what? It's weird is that reality has a way of showing up. You can live in your we've all had moments in our lives where we were living in some kind of semi-diluted state, maybe not you guys, but you have moments when you think, this is my world, I trust this world, and then it isn't what you thought it was. Reality has a tendency to actually show up in the room sometimes. So
usually when you're you're in bliss, in some sort of heady relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Some kind of deep romance,
Then reality comes along and knocks you on the head. We've got a couple of little comments here that I just want to share. We've got one from Mighty Johnny. Very striking visuals. Thanks for that, John. Another one from James Gray. Lovely stuff. I'm liking this. And we've got a question from Barry Renshaw for you, Annie. Hi, Anne. What was the relationship with Karen Berger or any editors on the Seeds? With so many years in comics and journalism, what do you now look for from an editor in comics? Interesting question.
Well, I've been really lucky to have really good editors, but with Karen, that's you're at the top of the game. Yeah. Karen is pretty much she's a brilliant editor because she has something that I learned originally I was trained under Louise Simonson, and Wheezy Simonson, Wheezy Jones, she has a lot of different names. She was, she could crack a whip and rip your story apart, and somehow you would leave happy as if you've just been told that she loved it. It was Karen is a very, very tough editor. I'd send her a script and she would send back these notes that somehow were so right. And she would do it in such a way that you were never depressed or demoralized. It was always they were always embraced with such belief and in your work. And you know, she's the best in the business, and you can see from her line of books. I mean, her books have been amazing.
Incredible. Yeah, incredible track record.
If you look at the history of Karen Berger as an editor, you go from Vertigo, where she was, you as in the UK know that she was bringing all these voices in and allowing everyone to have their voice. You know, we wouldn't have a lot of the great and fun sensibilities that we have in comics today through the British voices if it wasn't for, you know, Karen and her team at Vertigo. And so she's sort of doing something similar with Berger Books. We also worked, she was also the editor of Ruby Falls, which you can see back there.
Yeah.
Which, you know, she was very determined that it be a female artist from female perspectives, female writer, female artist, female perspective, 3 generations of women. And, you know, that's her. That's her knowing that's important and helping me and Flavia Biondi, who's like an amazing artist that I'm pretty sure you're going to see more of her because she's a dream storyteller. She just, I don't know if you've seen that book, but there's this is the Italian edition.
Wow, I can see the cover. Looks beautiful.
I love the Italian cover. Yeah.
That's nice. Yeah.
You see the gloss and the mats combined. Wow.
She's just, I don't know how to. She's just such a stunning artist, Flavia.
That's a lovely design.
Being over here, Annie, we grew up with a lot of European influences, whether it was through Asterix and Tintin or, of course, heavy metal. So one of my very early experiences was going to France at the age of 12, walking into a supermarket. And I used the age of 12 very specifically and picking up a Milo Manara book for the first time. And I think my eyes were woken up to the power of comics at that point.
Well, we had, because I was at Marvel in the 80s on staff, you know, Archie Goodwin had Epic, and Epic magazine had a kind of a heavy metal
definitely
times, and he also brought in a lot of the British artists.
I mean, you've worked with some of the greatest. You've worked with some of the greatest editors, haven't you, Annie? I mean, there's Denny O'Neil.
Denny O'Neil was a huge influence on me because I credit Denny with empowering me to put a sense of social justice journalism stories in the Daredevil comic. Like he very much, because, you know, when I met Denny, he had just finished his run as Iron Man's alcoholism. And that was from Denny's struggles with alcohol. And so you had a living, breathing example of somebody who knew how to take what was inside and put it in a superhero comic and having it work. So, you know, Denny would read, when I would do a new issue of Daredevil, I had Ralph Macchio, who was an incredibly supportive editor. I had Johnny Romita Jr., who was like phenomenal storyteller and his creations. I wouldn't have done a lot of the stories I did if I didn't know that Johnny could do what he did. Like, you know, and it's funny. People are always like, "Oh, you did such, you know, powerful journalistic stories," but then people forget that I even that I had Daredevil fighting a vacuum cleaner.
I mean, some of those stories were so out there, but I love them.
Nuts. They're so nuts.
And the visuals, some of those big sweeping, like half-page and full-page visuals that Johnny did, you know, especially the Mephisto saga, you know, absolutely stunning stuff.
That's all Johnny. Johnny, you know, I don't remember how that came up. I knew that we were doing this Marvel Universe shared event thing, and we knew we were taking New York to hell. Like all the books were on some level going to hell, and so we wanted to play with Mephisto. And Johnny was like, "I want to redesign Mephisto because you have the classic Mephisto who just looks like a human, you know, playing
bad cosplay."
He was always sitting in his chair, you know, the classic like John you know, Mephisto, and Johnny was like, you know what, evil is like a little more ornery than that. He wanted Mephisto's body to actually just start doing weird things. And then we had him we gave him a son, Blackheart. Yeah. And so that a lot of that was just Johnny, you know. He had an incredible, you know, he was a tough guy. He was, you know, we were both Italian and we were both knew New York really well. And so I could throw something at him that was very street and he would get it, you know.
I mean, Hell's Kitchen came to life when you guys were doing that. I mean, you know, you knew that place so well from the comics, you know.
Oh yeah, because that's where I lived. I walked those streets, and also, you know, like especially like I never would have been able to have Daredevil have a drink with the devil in a bar if I didn't have an artist who also kind of was familiar with the inside of a bar, you know.
Yeah.
There's a country song in there somewhere, isn't there?
Yeah. There definitely is.
Yeah, there is.
I mean, the other thing is, as well as, you know, you have this big sweeping story about Mephisto and you know how he was trying to take Daredevil's soul, and that was amazing stuff. And then you get these street level stories about these little characters. I remember the Rock Gut story and things like that, you know, and they were real character studies. I mean, and I loved the way that when you construct a story, you did it in a way that I'd never read before at the time, which was it was through the dialogue, it was through the monologues of the characters, and there was no like clumsy exposition that you used to get in the 80s with a lot of other writers, you know, so and so's doing this and so and so's doing that.
I think there's a couple things that I think writing for Marvel Comics before the IP got so valuable, we were allowed to do stuff. I mean, do you really think that, you know, Daredevil right now could have Daredevil get beaten up by a vacuum cleaner?
Very unlikely. I'd say a lot of those stories wouldn't happen, you know. There was so much in there that you just couldn't do now.
No, my whole run couldn't happen. I mean, sometimes I think about how did Marvel Comics let me do the Typhoid Mary stories? I mean, Typhoid Mary used to like kill someone and then have sex, you know. And she also used to when she had she had the 4 personalities. For people that are watching that have never heard of her, she had 4 personalities in the same person. And John Romita and I came up with her because we wanted somebody who would seduce Matt Murdock and Daredevil separately. So we sent Innocent Mary after Matt Murdock to appeal to his like lawyer brain. Let's do things by the book. And she's innocent. And then we had Typhoid seduce Daredevil, who is like, forget the law, it doesn't work. I'm putting on the devil suit and kicking ass. And so we designed her to attack from those 2 angles. But then when Bloody Mary came in, the 3rd personality, I mean, he just went to a cop shop, looked up the records of beaten women, and went out and bruise for bruise beat up men. You know, it gave them the exact injuries they had given to some woman. That was in a series I did with John Van Fleet. I did a series of typhoid stories later with Fred Harper, John Van Fleet, and
I love that series. Yeah,
and also, you know, we lost someone who was very wonderful artist, Marvel artist, and collaborator who we lost to COVID last week. Steve Lytle. Steve Lytle did. We did a lot of typhoid stories together. And so, you know, I think that the 80s were before comics were selling like crazy. The 90s, they went through the roof. Then they crashed. And then now today, because the IP is so valuable, there's a lot of scrutiny. You know?
There wasn't any scrutiny in the 80s, really, was there? I mean, you could get away with a lot more.
You could get away with a lot more, and I think that the wacky stories can end up being kind of inspirational because they show you that you don't have to just keep the character canon and within this tight, straight jacket, lockjaw. This is, this is who Superman is. You can like stretch, stretch the characters because they always snap back to shape. It's like you guys go out and get drunk and crazy one night. The next day, you're exactly who you were before.
Oh, no, not in Britain. We just carry on through the weekend.
It's not a good night if we're still the same. But yeah, the thing I loved about your Matt Murdock was that he was, he had all these faults. And the way that he would put other characters on a pedestal, like the way he put Mary on a pedestal, thinking that she was something that she wasn't. And I think that was a really interesting analogy for just like what men do sometimes with women.
Matt does all the time, isn't it? Matt Murdock keeps doing the same thing.
And I love that, how that was so concentrated in those stories. And then Typhoid was just like, whoa, I'm going to surprise you because I'm going to be the more feral side of femininity. I mean,
she's nuts. It is. And when I saw her show up in the Iron Fist show, I was like, holy shit, are they going to have her like, killing men and having sex? Dead bodies, how far are they going to take this?
It was a pale reflection of the comic version.
Yeah, it was. I enjoyed it, of course, because it's fun to see your your the toys that were meant just for a sandbox suddenly like up on the screen. But I didn't know how far they were going to take that, and then the Netflix deal got canceled. So so if I was still an editor at Marvel Comics, I think it would be really fun to have a book that was like off IP, off canon.
Come
in and say, I have a really weird Silver Surfer story, and what I'd like to do is Silver Surfer, and then you come up with something that is completely would be rejected normally, and they let you do it.
Well, Marvel does.
Sorry, Ollie.
Marvel does. Oh, go on, Shane.
I just wanted to bring in this question because it links a little bit to what you were saying, Annie. What stories would you like to see mainstream superheroes comics explore further, and what would you like to see done more of in indie comics?
Well, I mean, I think that, like what I was just saying, if somebody says to you, okay, here's your assignment, do a Poison Ivy story, or whoever it is, like you can play classic, you can just say, I'm going to do a classic Poison Ivy story, or you can come up with like these like wackier ideas. And one of the things, I really liked when Tom King put the Vision in Suburbia.
Oh, that was great.
As if like, wow, he's a robot, he's an android or whatever the hell he is, how would it be if he had to be in the real true robot society, which is like American suburbia? And then, a lot of editors would have said, oh, that's not a Vision story. They let him do it. And now you can see the DNA of that series in WandaVision.
Yeah, definitely.
So, I mean, it's like you never know when some writer strikes on a vein of something that's interesting, because, growing up, I grew up in the 60s and the 60s weren't like the rock and roll 60s when I was a little kid. They were more like the Leave It to Beaver, Dick Van Dyke, 60s TV, every house the same on us. I was in suburbia. So, when I watch WandaVision, I'm like, feeling those 60s TV shows. And I actually don't know what new viewers who weren't raised on those kind of claustrophobic, claustrophobic. Don't do anything that isn't like what you would do in suburbia. I don't know how young viewers are seeing that. If they're getting it, that it's a
I don't think a lot are, to be honest, and because I've seen a lot of the responses to WandaVision, and a lot of younger viewers, and not just younger viewers, older viewers as well, just not getting the references, but also not getting the cultural stuff. Like you say, you know, like there's the scene where the beds are separate beds.
Yes, exactly.
Because back then you couldn't show a couple in bed. No. And then they bring the bed together.
Push it together. Yeah, I mean, it's like that was like a Hollywood, both Hollywood and TV. It was code. They called it the code, you know.
Yes.
And pre-code, you could have people in one bed, and then when the code came in, like for instance, if a man and a woman sit on a bed, one of them had to keep a foot on the floor. Like
crazy.
Yeah, you can.
Like snooker.
Google Hollywood code of the 50s, and you will see all these rules. And you know, and so they were always coming up with really inventive ways to show. Like there's a famous Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn movie where they obviously maybe they slept together, and the next day she has his hat. He left his hat at her place, and she goes, "Here's your hat. What's your hurry?" You know, and it was sort of like it was like coded in so many levels. And it was like that was their way because they weren't allowed to show a sex scene.
Yeah,
So in some ways, it makes the writers more creative.
Oh yeah,
they've got to be challenged. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean,
sorry, Ollie. It was the same for comics, I think, as well, because obviously back in there was a point in the 80s, and you know, from the 50s to the 80s, where the Comics Code Authority was still alive, and yet I look at some of those pre-code books, and they're more daring in some ways than the books that are being published now. You know, but they were being clever and they were working past the code, but they were getting real powerful messages across sometimes, like despite these restrictions. You know, and that's testament to those writers, I think, who were able to do that. It's just absolutely incredible.
I kind of vaguely sort of remember when I was working at Marvel, it's sort of dawning on us, why do we even send these books to the code? Like, why do we even do that? You know, and there were like and it was always so stupid. The code stuff was so stupid because you'd send them a black and white, and you'd get back. It was so predictable, really predictable. Like too much TNA. They never cared about violence. You could like slaughter blood splattering everywhere. But if someone in their leotard was all naked, you had to, you know, draw like the ends of, and we wouldn't even change the body. You would just draw something to make
clothing. Yeah, I've got original artwork actually. I've got a Bill Sienkiewicz page where Mary Jane is in like a negligee and Spider-Man's web swinging with her, but he's actually had to stick over with a fully clothed, you know, more clothing onto the artwork. He just stuck it on, you know, but you can see that underneath there's this negligee. You know, it's an absolute craziness, you know. But like you say, violence, you know, what I would call pornographic violence.
Yeah, pornographic violence is fine. Yeah.
We do have this, like, you know, this Western thing about, you know, this problem with the human body, you know, and whereas we have no problem with people desecrating it.
Like chopping heads off, like
it's very odd. It's very odd.
Yeah.
You always have a nightmare on Elm Street, but you can't have sex on Elm Street.
Yeah,
I like that. So, Ollie, you had a question before, and
I did. Well, I mean, it's gone past there, but you've mentioned the great editors that you've been fortunate to work with, but then you started mentioning the great artists. You mentioned John, you mentioned Steve, who passed away last year. Yeah. And before we got on camera,
he just passed away 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, was it 2 weeks ago already? And
2 years ago, we didn't have COVID.
No,
yeah.
And And of course, just before we came on air, you mentioned a time when you travelled to Great Britain to team up with the great John Bolton.
Yes, John Bolton, yeah.
He's a friend of ours.
Well, the funny thing about, I mean, and this gets back to the artist, you know, you're right, you're only as good as your artist, and you're inspired by the artist. So, for instance, the Seeds, you know, David Aha and I had done, we had done a Daredevil story together, and years ago, and I knew that one of the things that he was just so great at was taking sort of incidental things and turning them into visual riffs. Like it was, the story took place at Coney Island, and just what he did with the roller coaster, the famous Coney Island cyclone, and the firecrackers, just how he riffed on visuals, and it definitely inspired the way that I worked with David. And with John Bolton, it was similar in that John and I had done a series of X-Men stories. They were backups in classic X-Men. And they got weirder and weirder and weirder. And John and I would just like yak away. I think he was doing something for Archie Goodwin's office, maybe some creator-owned thing or Epic or something. And John and I just started talking all the time about, like, you know, what if like the X-Men were trapped in a chess game, or what if, you know, and we would just be like, we would riff together, and we did these like super, super strange X-Men stories. Like the kind of stories where I would kind of dread reading them again because I have a feeling they were so weird. And then John and I were just like, well, let's do a graphic novel. And it was my first creator-owned graphic novel. And we did this graphic novel that was sort of based on the childhood fears of what's in the closet. But it was, John ended up basing the comic on his family. So Liliana, his wife, is in the comic, and both his kids are in the comic. And he just was able to just absorb his family into the comic. They are the family. And so all the like toys and the clothing and the look and everything is his family. So, and I mean, I love that book is strange because I think we thought it was for kids, but it's so scary.
You did a comic with John Bolton and you thought it was going to be for kids.
Yeah, well, I think both of us just sort of forgot that we were writing for kids. Oh, there it is.
There we go.
There we go.
We both just sort of forgot we're writing for kids, and we made it scarier and scarier and scarier.
Well,
and then I think that's
Salvador Dali.
It's like a weird problem with the book because it's not for kids, but it's not for adults either. It's like some kind of a in-betweener book that's meant for no one. But
it's very playful, isn't it? Yeah, it's playful like a child's story, but the content isn't for children, as it were. So it's
very, very dark. And so John and I were doing a tour. We did, I think it was like France, United Kingdom, and or maybe just United Kingdom and Scotland, and so they overbooked us. They booked us for like 2 signings and 2 different stores and radio shows, but too many. And so then they had to hire a race car driver to rocket us from city to city to city to city, and of course, you know, at some point he got pulled over and busted for speaking. We were speaking the whole time. And I do remember, I loved Manchester. You have Manchester has a radio station?
Yeah, Piccadilly Radio in Manchester.
Yeah, I remember that. And then Birmingham, I think the night we spent in Birmingham was like, there was some kind of like, I don't know, workers' riot going on in this street they're filled with.
That doesn't surprise me. I put on a convention in Birmingham, on an annual convention, and there's always something going on to cause a problem for the convention. Usually something to do with like building works or a riot.
To be fair, Shane, I think one of them. No, I remember being on an anti-racist riot once when our friend Paul had put on a Comic Con as well. Birmingham being Britain's second biggest city, has a lot of character, shall we say?
Yeah, it's a hardcore town. I mean, it's a hardcore working man's town. So
yeah.
So and what's interesting is that I got a call from one of John's children, the one that I think we had named him Spike in the comic, and he is now animating this comic book.
Wow.
Oh,
sent me some like clips, and it looks fabulous. And I don't know, I don't know what'll happen with that, but I think it's just so great that now his kid is.
Wow, that's amazing. So it lives on through another generation and a different medium. Hopefully.
Yeah, because those are John's kids. I love that family so much.
Wow.
Family.
Who knows? It might lead to a reprint of this crazy, wacky graphic novel. You never know, do you? I mean, I think, there's a huge, and I don't think it's a nostalgia. If something's good, it needs to be put out there. Do you know what I mean?
Well, it's funny because there was a company, Graffiti Books.
Yes.
Reprinted it and asked John and I to add pages. And the pages we added were so sick and disturbing that we definitely wrecked the market for that book. Because it's like, maybe the most of the story you could kind of say, okay, a kid's story, but the end pages, we just went nuts, and it's so gross and bloody. And then Dark Horse reprinted it, and I remember that I was kind of like, well, maybe you should reprint it in its original form, because those end pages kind of wreck it for the kids market. And they included them, and so therefore you can't. I can't give this book to any kid, even though it's meant for kids.
maybe you can do a radio version and a parental guidance required version.
Just ironically put the Comics Code Authority on it with a big red circle. It's definitely not approved by the Comics Code Authority.
But I suppose it shows how far we've come in the, when you introduce Lola into it, she's naked from the sort of waist down and goes to the toilet. Of course, I know that we're talking about how crazy it was in the 80s, but I dare say you wouldn't get away with Typhoid Mary doing that in a Daredevil comic, surely.
No, I don't think she could have. I don't think she could have. But that was just like such a relaxed, because I knew Lola was going to get pregnant by the alien. And so I wanted this moment when she was kind of like doing the thing girls do after you have sex with the toilet so you don't get pregnant, and it was just like such a casual thing that we, didn't really want it even commented on. And, so this one line that's like, what are you doing? Getting rid of you.
Yeah.
It's
again, it's David Ahar's sort of like power. It just does feel like a domestic scene. Okay, it's 2 minutes into the future.
So naturalistic, the pose as well.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also just, it's such the respectful drawings of females. Yeah. I mean, you can feel that, it's funny when you work with artists, sometimes you can kind of tell the ones that respect women and the ones that don't. By how they draw women. And sometimes you can even tell the ones that have been with a lot of women and those that
haven't. Say no more. We know exactly what you mean.
I won't say how many there are of each group in comics.
There are some that don't even know what a naked woman looks like.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like that shot works because David drew that shot, because it's it's a very almost like it's just a very relaxed, naturalistic. And then underneath that, Lola is falling for the alien and kind of realizes she doesn't have a shot at the alien. He's going to leave. And so there's another under Getting Rid of You, of course, she's actually thinking the opposite in her head. And so it's, that panel, I rewrote it. You rewrite over and over and over until you get the exact right words.
Wow.
Get in all the layers. And there's that moment in that scene where he because you know he says, because she has in a wheelchair and she gets around on crutches, and he says, need help, and she says never. And then by the end of the comic, she's accepting some help, which is, you know, one of the aliens is pushing her in a wheelchair at one point, and it's kind of like, you know, you want there to be a tiny bit mini arc. You want to naturalize everything and not call attention to it. At the same time, have like just a tiny visual arc for whether people notice or not. I don't know, but you know.
I mean, a lot of people will, I'm sure, and it's very. I mean, it must be incredibly difficult to do that. I mean, I admire it so much, and as you say, your process of rewriting and rewriting until you get that natural dialogue and that natural movement. It must. I mean, people don't see all that work on the page; they see the finished.
No, a lot of it is torturing your friends because you know, whenever you like working on a script, you're always grabbing your friends and saying like, you know, you play Lola, you play Race. Okay, do the scene. And then my friends would act it out, and I would hear, it's a trick that you know, you learn from film, because I've worked in film a lot, I've made a lot of films, not a lot of films, but especially teaching film in Haiti, we developed a method of working that was very improvisational, because it's, you know, we never had the time or the money to actually do the normal Hollywood style. And so we would build scripts by acting them out, not writing them. So
so sort of improvising the situation.
We would come up with the beginning and end point of a scene and know how much time we had, and then act it out, and then tape it, and then write down the dialogue, and then, you know, so we would build scripts that way for making films in Haiti. And so I've kind of learned that method in Haiti and kind of adapted it to work now, is that, you know, you're always trying to grab your friends and make them, you know, act out scenes. And a lot of it is just, you know, can I say this line out loud? Does it work?
You
know? And
I think more comic writers need to do that, actually, because
that's a great insight, isn't it, Shane?
It is. It's really good insight. I mean, for anyone you know who wants to be a writer, that's fascinating.
I would say anybody out there that wants to make comics, just try it. Grab your you know, and the other thing, that it works with anyone, because you can cast against type. You know, if you have 2 kids and you want them to act out adult language, you'll learn stuff by having someone who you wouldn't normally cast in that role trying to do it. So you know, just play, have more fun. I mean, I guess that's what I miss in comics, is, you know, is just more of a sense of play. And that's one of the things I loved working with David, because there's David and Karen, because the 3 of us, there was a big sense of play, you know, in terms of like bouncing stuff around. And and you can feel it. You can feel Karen. When I read it, I can feel Karen in the book. I can feel, you know. And then David was able to bring all his obsessions in. You have to be really flexible. You have to roll with everything. You know, like when you have a whole plan for how the masks are going to look and how people's personalities will be in the mask, and then he says, I want to do gas mask. You have to just say, go for it, roll.
It works very well. The gas
it makes sense.
Because you want the artist to be completely engaged and to feel like they are a fellow storyteller. I mean, and then it gets into that whole thing of there's the writer who writes the story and comes up with it and all that stuff. There's the artist that draws it, but there's a place. Most of the comic is that middle ground of storyteller, your co-storytellers. So, you know, and it's hard because, you know, we had a little more time on this comic. Normally you don't have any time ever, and you're just like, you know, you have to do one a month, 20 pages, so 22 pages a month. That's like a movie a month. It's like sometimes you're writing 2 or 3 books a month. It's impossible to have that kind of play, because, you know, literally the writer's late, the artist has to do 6 pages, that morning and get them to the letter, and and so it's
like a grind, isn't it? I guess, and that's always fascinated me, like how you managed to create Daredevil the way you guys did, because it did have that element of play. It was groundbreaking. There was a lot in those little stories, every single one of them. And I was always amazed how you managed to turn out such interesting scripts, such interesting ideas in that short amount of time. I mean, I imagine that you were just on this creative roll, you guys, at the time.
Yeah, much more of a creative role, and just excited, and we were young, and I also think that there's a reason serial TV has writers' rooms and multiple directors, because what we do in comics, literally out 12 movies a year, and 12 mini arcs, and then longer arcs, and then years of arcs. Normally, you have a writer's room for a TV show where they've got 5 or 6 writers, they've got showrunners, and then they send each episode out to a different director often.
Yeah.
So that's how, when you start to think about how they do serial television, it's amazing that people do serial comics and have a consistent writer-artist team over any length of time, and eventually the artist just gets burnt out, the writers get burnt out, you realize you're repeating yourself and you need a break and you need to do something else. And also when you're in that kind of like, another story, you don't have time to do the kind of stuff I can do in the Seeds. I mean, if Johnny and I, when we were doing Daredevil, to do the Seeds version of Daredevil, we would have put out 1 issue a year,
Yeah, that's why it was so impressive, because even obviously it's a different type of comic altogether, but even so, it was incredible stuff. And but so do you prefer then this process of creating one-off stories as opposed to working on serials? It sounds like you do.
I think it depends on where you are in your life. I mean, it's funny because other than a small handful of people, we don't get rich making comics. I mean, other than like you've got some that say when Todd McFarlane did Spider-Man, and suddenly they were selling like hotcakes, and you have windfall moments. The Bat books for a while at DC, huge amounts of money. But for the most part, your average, artist writer, you're not making you're just staying afloat. So you have to work that way, especially if you have a family and kids. So, I would say that also there's points in your life when you just feel more operatic. You look at a filmmaker's career, like take anybody, Kurosawa, or you have like moments in a director's career or a screenwriter's career where they want to do epics, they want to do operatic, and
they've got the energy. They've got the energy to do it.
The energy, and then as you get reach a sort of wiser point in your life, you kind of like want to do something a little more, I don't know, wise and small and poetic. You look at like the difference between like some of Kurosawa's, small films versus his Ron or one of the, monster
very
films.
different. Yeah.
And so I think it depends on who you are and where you are in your life. So it's all good though, it's all good. It's all fun.
Yeah, and it's nice basically to be able to do what you love for a living, isn't it? That's the mark of success. I always say it's not about what you earn; it's about how much you love what you're doing. Yeah.
Well, and it's weird because after doing Ruby Falls and the Seeds, I've had these like weird feelings of like, what if I had started as an indie comic person and stayed an indie comic person? Would my voice have come out more? Because I was always trying to speak through superheroes, because that was what was there. And even though there was a rich indie market, I was always a little bit too, I don't know, I didn't trust my own voice enough to go through, like, you know, then you'd look at somebody like Harvey Pekar, who really did believe that every little tiny thought in his head was worth putting on the page, and it was. And that was kind of like revelatory, you know, that like.
I love stuff like that. I mean, I love stuff that is just about the creator, you know, and I love stuff like James Chalker and things like that, you know, that I think they speak to the reader in a real sort of direct way, you know. Okay, we've actually. Sorry, go on.
Out of time, yeah, haven't we?
Yeah, we've hit way past the hour.
Past the hour. Sorry about that.
Yeah, we have to start winding up the machine again if you're not careful.
Yeah, I know. So you know that, like, you got another one after this, and then I know what you're gonna say, Shane. You're gonna say, you know, you're my favorite, and I can't wait. You know, like, you just feel for the next guy.
I'm not going to give you that bullshit, Annie. All right. I've already said anyway. You're one of my favorite writers, and I made it. You know, it just happens to be true.
He's geeked out on our Facebook
say that to all the podcasts.
No, you watch the others.
The good ones, Annie.
I don't say that very often. We've got one last question before we go from one of the viewers, Barry Renshaw. He asks, is there a dream project that you're drawn to if a publisher could give free rein and choice of collaborator?
Yeah, I'm actually right now doing something I've never done before, which is drawing. I'm not necessarily drawing in order to draw my own comic. I'm drawing in order to find the next story I want to tell.
You're storyboarding.
Huh?
You're storyboarding, Annie.
I'm storyboarding.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually, and I always did my own thumbnails. I never show them to anybody, but I do them because you want to make sure that what you're asking the artist to do can be done. And so I would do scribbles to make sure. So I'm drawing now, and I've really always wanted to do a story that influenced by all the time I spent in Haiti. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about right now. But you know, it's in the baby stages.
Yeah, it's finding someone with the right sensibilities to make that come to life, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we'll certainly look out for that, and I'm hoping that a lot of our readers turn up to buy the seeds because
we've only sold 2 copies so far, so we really like.
Come on, guys!
That'll be me and Shane.
Otherwise, David and I will owe Dark Horse a lot of money.
Well, I can say it's a great book, and it really is.
I was very impressed. I must admit, very impressed indeed. It's right up my alley, and I must admit, considering I thought we were going to start just by promoting the seed, I've had such a wonderful insight into not only your career but the way you approach writing as well, from the thumbnails to acting it out. It's been really insightful, especially for anyone out there thinking about breaking into writing. So thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you. Nice to meet you guys.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure.
And hopefully we'll see you in Britain one day at Thought Bubble if Comic Con start up again.
Know, isn't there one
Ice, Ollie.
Right.
Ice.
I'll go.
Come to Ice. He's always plugging other people's shows on my show. But yeah, I mean, Thought Bubble is a great show, I will say.
Yeah, I've heard that's a great one. I want to go to that one,
You are, of course, always welcome to come to Ice and revisit Birmingham.
Yes.
Yay!
There's a couple guys I have something to say to in Birmingham. No.
We'll see what we can do to sort that out then, Annie.
Bye.
Enjoy the rest of the day, Annie, and all the best. Thank you.
Bye-bye.